Explosives and build engine titles have one thing in common, actually multiple things in common. They are useful against much bigger threats, blowing up cracked holes on the walls, and the chances of backfiring once you go trigger happy in a multiplayer session. But have you tried using explosives to get into hard to reach areas? Now you might be wondering how I managed to reach up there without dying so easily. Let me explain that. Going back to games like Duke Nukem 3D, which is pretty much the first popular title powered under Ken Silverman's build engine, albeit the most popular out of the bunch. Explosive weapons like the RPG deal more damage, which makes it less likely to survive a single rocket to the face, unless you had a full set of armor and at least 150 health from at least picking up one atomic health. Not to mention that surviving a single rocket to the face only knocks the player horizontally instead of vertically or diagonally. It even makes more sense when the shareware version of Duke Nukem 3D came out months before the original shareware release of Quake, and not to mention the deathmatch test coming out a month after. And many first-person shooter games that had multiplayer functionality beforehand also relied on horizontal-based combat. Even the horizontal knockbacks still have their use cases, with Doom being a prime example of that, even more so with levels involving a teleport or exit. However, in Shadow Warrior's case, the logic seems to remain like this despite coming out in 1997, when Quake was already getting very popular. Meanwhile, Blood did come out in the same year as Shadow Warrior, but they handle explosions differently, in conjunction with the game's movement logic being more smooth and bouncy, while the previous two games had somewhat stiff movement. And what do I mean by stiff movement is that Duke Nukem 3D kind of feels more stiff, especially with how player jumping is handled, while Shadow Warrior is more of a middle ground since the jumping doesn't feel as stiff, but it is bound to the horizontal pushbacks given to the player. Blood's explosions are handled differently by giving it a more dynamic radius that expands during the explosion, instead of a static radius that determines how much damage will be caused. This meant that even if you weren't that far into the explosion, it takes more damage just forcing yourself into the radius rather than just being pushed away from it. Now, this and the game's physics pretty much explain why the player and the enemies can be sent up into the air, making Blood one of the only build engine titles capable of vertical rocket jumping. But it's definitely not the first game to help popularize it. Now, Quake is often credited for popularizing what would become vertical rocket jumping, while games like Rise of the Triad and Marathon made it possible in the first place. Now, not only vertical rocket jumping became a very useful tactic in single player and also speedrunning, but also became a very interesting advanced technique for deathmatches. In games like Blood, napalm jumping in this case can be very effective in bloodbath levels, such as bodies. One prime example is that one area that had a napalm launcher, a super armor, and a life seed from above. That area with the life seed can normally be accessed through a stair entrance, but doing so will risk losing control of the napalm and super armor. Even worse is when one would pretty much take the opportunity to spam napalm on your way there. So of course the best route would be to napalm jump right as you pick up the super armor, or at least have a decent amount of fire armor to deal less damage. Now, the napalm launcher isn't exactly the only viable weapon for reaching higher areas, as dynamite could be very useful as well, especially with the remote detonators being the fastest to detonate if done properly, by jumping right as it explodes. Of course, this would be more seen as grenade jumping, just like in Quake, where you practically have to time it right just to do a jump with a grenade instead of a rocket. And even that's more difficult to master than it would be for rocket jumping, because you have to heavily rely on timing. Well, there you have it. As it currently stands, Blood appears to be the only build engine game with some form of vertical rocket jumping and mid-air kills. If you want to try this for yourself, however, I recommend grabbing a copy of One Unit Whole Blood, the Not Blood source port, and NukemNet for multiplayer action. As a matter of fact, at the time of making this video, Blood Fresh Supply is on sale for $2 on GOG. and it comes with the original 1 unit whole blood as a bonus. But anyway, that's about it for this video. What would you like me to cover next, and what are your thoughts on rocket jumping as a mechanic? This video's Patreon vocal shoutout goes to Kuji. Thank you as always. And as always, thank you all for watching and peace out. See ya.